Monica Johnson had spent 8 years working the night shift at a small gas station on the outskirts of Houston, and in all that time, almost nothing had changed. The pumps were the same rusted silver, the fluorescent lights buzzed the same tired hum, and Monica still earned $9 an hour, clocking in before sunset and clocking out long after midnight, her feet aching and her eyes heavy by the time she drove home to her apartment on the edge of town. She was 32 years old, and on most nights, she told herself that things would eventually get better, that hard work had a way of rewarding patience. She just hadn't seen the proof yet, but the night everything changed started like any other. Slow, rainy, unremarkable, until a stranger walked through the door and left something behind that would test everything Monica had ever believed about herself. The apartment Monica rented was a one-bedroom unit on the third floor of a building that had seen better decades. The walls were thin enough to hear the neighbor's television. The carpet was worn pale in front of the door, and the radiator made a knocking sound on cold nights that she had stopped bothering to report to the landlord. She kept the place clean obsessively so, because it was one of the few things in her life she could control. She folded her dish towels. She organized the small shelf of books above the kitchen table. She kept the counters clear, even when the refrigerator had almost nothing in it. Neatness was not a luxury she allowed herself to abandon, no matter how exhausted she felt when she finally got home at 2 in the morning. On nights when money was especially tight, which was most nights, she would eat instant noodles standing at the counter, too tired to sit, watching the steam rise from the bowl and thinking about the long list of bills she hadn't yet managed to pay. The financial picture Monica lived inside was not dramatic in the way that made people stop and stare. It was the slow, grinding kind of hardship that wore a person down over years, not a sudden collapse, but a constant low-level pressure that never quite let up. Her car, a 10-year-old sedan with a cracked dashboard and a check engine light that glowed permanently orange, had been to the mechanic 3 times in the past year. Each repair had cost her more than she had, and she'd paid for 2 of them by borrowing from her cousin with no clear timeline for paying him back. Her electric bill ran high in the Houston summers, and she had gotten into the habit of sitting in the dark for a few hours each evening before work just to keep the usage down. Her health insurance was the cheapest plan she could find, with a deductible so high that she had not gone to the doctor in 2 years. Not for the persistent cough she'd had since January, not for the headaches she wrote off as stress. She had not bought new clothes in over a year. The black polo shirts she wore for work had started to fade at the collar, but she ironed them carefully every week and kept them looking as presentable as she could manage. She had a gift, people sometimes said, for making things last. Her coworker, Darnell, called it resourcefulness. Monica called it necessity. On the rare nights, she treated herself a cup of coffee from the gas station machine that she didn't have to pay for because she worked there, a package of peanut butter crackers from the stockroom she'd log and pay for. Honestly, she felt something close to contentment. Not happiness exactly, but peace. A sense that she was managing, that she was holding it together, that the life she was living, however small, was hers, and she had not let it fall apart. What gave Monica the most trouble was not the poverty itself, but the invisibility of it. She smiled at every customer who came through her line. She remembered the names of the regulars. She asked about their kids, their weekends, their long drives home. She was the kind of person who made people feel seen, even when no one was doing the same for her. The assistant manager, a man named Gary, who mostly spent his shifts eating chips and watching sports highlights on his phone, had told her more than once that she had a natural way with people. She had smiled and said thank you and gone back to wiping down the counters. She knew what she was worth. She just hadn't found anyone else willing to recognize it yet. There were harder nights, of course. Nights when she sat in her car in the parking lot after her shift and let herself feel the weight of it all, the loans, the loneliness, the quiet fear that this was simply going to be her life, that no door was ever going to open. On those nights, she would sit for a few minutes in the dark, her hands loose in her lap, and then she would say something to herself, quietly, like a prayer or a promise, that she could be poor and still be decent, that circumstances did not have to define character, that she was more than the number on her paycheck. She believed that. She had to. It was the one thing no one could take from her. And she held on to it, like a light, in a very long tunnel. The night the stranger arrived, the rain had been coming down for nearly 2 hours. It was the kind of Houston rain that fell in sheets, that flooded the low-lying streets, and turned the parking lot into a shallow river of reflected neon. Monica had mopped the entrance 3 times already, and was standing behind the register with a cup of coffee going cold beside her when she heard the sound of tires on wet asphalt. She looked up through the streaked glass of the station window and saw a black SUV pull in slowly, its headlights cutting wide pale arcs through the rain. It was a late-model vehicle, the kind with a grille that gleamed like jewelry and tires that looked like they had never touched anything as ordinary as gravel. She watched it park with the quiet authority of a car that knew it was expensive. The man who stepped out was somewhere in his mid-50s, she guessed. He wore dark trousers, a plain gray button-down shirt, and a jacket that looked like it had cost more than Monica's monthly rent, though he wore it with the casual ease of a man who had long since stopped thinking about what things cost. He was not tall, not especially imposing, but there was something in the way he moved, unhurried, deliberate, comfortable in his own skin, that made her notice him. His hair was silver at the temples. He wore no watch that she could see, no visible jewelry. He carried himself quietly. She had served enough customers over 8 years to develop a rough taxonomy of wealth. The newly rich who needed you to notice. The comfortable middle class, who were polite but distracted, and the very wealthy who moved through the world as though the temperature had been set precisely for them. This man, she thought, belonged to the third category. He came inside and went straight to the coffee station, taking his time selecting a cup and studying the options the way people do when they are not in a hurry, when the clock is not pressing against them. Monica watched him from behind the register without staring, the way she had learned to keep track of customers without making anyone uncomfortable. He poured himself a black coffee, put a lid on it with a small, deliberate snap, and came to the counter. He placed 2 bills on the counter, both 20s, and said, without looking at the price board, that he would also like to fill the tank. His voice was even, warm, unhurried. She told him the total when the pump clicked off, made change, and he waved it away with a small motion of his hand. Not dramatically, not with flourish. Simply, as though the difference were genuinely inconsequential to him, he asked if it was always this quiet at night. She said mostly yes, that the regulars came through earlier in the evening, and after midnight it was mostly long-haul drivers and the occasional insomniac. He nodded at that, as though she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. He asked how long she'd been working nights. She said 8 years. He was quiet for a moment, and she expected him to say something politely vague, the way people did, when the answer to a question surprised them and they weren't sure what to do with it, but instead, he just looked at her and said he respected that, not in the hollow way people threw out compliments to fill silence. He said it simply, and it landed the way things land when they are meant. Outside, one of the attendants, a young man named Marcus, who worked the pumps on rainy nights, was finishing up with the SUV, and the man asked Monica to make sure Marcus got something for his trouble. He left a folded bill on the counter that, when Monica picked it up afterward, turned out to be $50. Then he thanked her, picked up his coffee, and walked back out into the rain. She watched the SUV ease out of the lot and disappear south on the wet highway, the red taillights blurring to nothing in the dark. She did not know his name. She did not know where he was going. She assumed she would not see him again. She went back to her counter and her cold coffee, and did not think about him for the rest of the hour. It was 20 minutes before her shift ended that she found the wallet. She was wiping down the counter beside the coffee station with a damp cloth, moving the stack of paper napkins, straightening the sugar packets, when she noticed it. It was tucked against the side of the machine, just behind where the man had been standing, a slim bifold wallet, in a shade of brown leather so dark it was almost black, the kind of leather that had been worked and aged until it was soft as cloth. She picked it up and already knew, even before she opened it, that it was his. She opened it slowly. The way you open something that doesn't belong to you but that circumstances have placed into your hands. What she saw made her breath catch. The cash section held a folded stack of $100 bills so thick that she counted once, then counted again to be sure. $8,300. More money than she had ever held in her hands at one time in her life. More than 2 months of her salary, before taxes. She stood very still for a moment, looking at the bills, and felt the full weight of what they represented: the car repair she'd been putting off for 6 months. The electric bill that had gone to collections. The cousin she owed money to. The pair of work shoes she'd been wearing with a hole in the left sole that she'd covered with a piece of cardboard. All of it. The cash in this wallet could solve all of it, and then some. And no one had seen her find it. She kept looking. Behind the cash were 4 credit cards, each embossed with a name she hadn't caught when he paid. There was a platinum card, the kind that had no printed limit on its face, and behind that, what appeared to be a card for a private aviation service. There were business cards, a folded receipt, and behind a clear plastic window, a Texas driver's license. She looked at the name. She looked at the address. She read it again, because sometimes you see something once, and your brain files it away wrong, and you need to look a second time to be sure. The address was outside Houston, in a neighborhood she recognized by name, if not by sight, one of the old money enclaves on the northwest side, where the houses sat behind iron gates, and the streets did not have sidewalks, because no one who lived there was expected to walk. The distance, she estimated, was somewhere around 40 miles. She stood there behind the counter holding a dead man's weight of cash in her hands, except he was not dead. He was 40 miles away, probably not even aware yet that he'd left it behind, and she thought about what to do. The thinking was honest. She did not pretend, even to herself, that the right answer was obvious or easy. She thought about her car. She thought about her electric bill. She thought about the coworker at her last job who had once told her that rich people never miss what they can't account for. And at the time she had nodded along even though she hadn't really agreed. She thought about the man himself, how he had waved away her change without hesitation, how he'd left $50 for Marcus without being asked, how he had moved through this world with the ease of someone for whom $8,000 was simply an inconvenience and not a catastrophe. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her, about how different the weight of that money was for her than it would ever be for him. To her, it was months of breathing room. To him, it was probably the cost of a dinner for clients. She felt the full, asymmetrical unfairness of that math, and she let herself feel it completely, because she believed in being honest about the things that were hard before she decided what to do about them. And then she set it down on the counter and went to find Gary. Gary was in the back, half watching highlights on his phone, and he looked up when she came in and told him what she'd found. He turned the wallet over in his hands with the mild curiosity of a man who had already decided this was not his problem. He told her to put it in the safe and call the non-emergency police line in the morning. She said the address on the license was 40 miles out, and she thought maybe she should try to return it that night. Gary looked at her the way people look at someone who has just suggested something that makes no practical sense. He said it was after 11, it was raining, and whoever the guy was, he wasn't going anywhere. Monica said she understood. Gary went back to his phone. She went back to the counter. Marcus had come in from outside and was dripping on the mat near the door, wringing water from his jacket. She told him what she'd found, and he whistled low and long and looked at the wallet with wide eyes. She asked him what he would do, and he shrugged with the honest shrug of a person who hasn't yet decided to be dishonest, but isn't sure how far honesty is supposed to go. He said if it were him, he probably wouldn't drive 40 miles in the rain for a man who clearly had more money than he knew what to do with. He said it not unkindly but plainly. The way people say things they believe are true. She nodded. She understood the logic. It was not unreasonable logic. It was just not hers. There was a moment, a single, specific moment she would remember years later when she looked at the wallet on the counter, looked at the rain coming down through the station window, and asked herself the question she had asked herself on all the hard nights in the parking lot. The question she used as a compass when everything else was uncertain. What kind of person did she want to be? Not what kind of person did circumstances require her to be. Not what kind of person would no one blame her for being. What kind of person, in the truest and quietest part of herself, did she actually want to be? She knew the answer. She had always known it. She told Marcus she'd be back before morning. She pulled on her jacket, put the wallet carefully in the inside pocket, where it sat flat and close against her chest, and walked out into the rain to her car. The drive started badly and got worse. The check engine light was already on. It was always on, but within the first 10 miles, something underneath the chassis began making a sound she hadn't heard before. A low, periodic grinding that seemed to come and go with the speed of the wipers, which made no mechanical sense, but which she could not stop hearing. The rain was coming sideways now. The kind of rain that overwhelmed the wipers, no matter how fast they moved, and she was navigating mostly by the white dashes of the lane markers and the occasional bloom of headlights from oncoming traffic. She had looked up the address on her phone before she left and memorized the route. Because her phone's battery was at 11%, and she did not want to drain it on navigation. She had a charging cable in the car, but the charging port had not worked in 4 months. It was one of those small, chronic failures. She had stopped mentally filing under problems. Because there were only so many problems a person could hold in their mind at once. She thought about what she was doing. 40 miles in the rain, on a failing car, with $8,000 in her jacket and the needle on her gas gauge drifting closer to the orange. She had put $15 of gas in before she left, the most she could put on her debit card without pushing it into overdraft, and she calculated that it should be enough to get there and most of the way back. Most of the way. She told herself she'd figure out the rest. She thought about what she would say when she got there. She didn't have a rehearsed speech. She wasn't the kind of person who needed one. She would hand over the wallet and say she had found it at the station and thought he should have it back. That was the whole sentence. Everything else was just weather. She kept both hands on the wheel and watched the road the way you watch something that might surprise you, not with fear exactly, but with steady attention. The radio was broken. Had been broken for 2 years. And so the drive was silent, except for the rain and the wipers and the intermittent grinding sound that she had decided, by the 20-mile mark, to simply accept as the car's way of complaining without actually quitting. She respected that. She had done the same thing herself many times. Somewhere around the 20-mile mark, the car made a sound like something important had briefly and dangerously caught on something else, and then it did not make that sound again, which was either reassuring or more alarming. She couldn't decide which. She kept driving. The neighborhoods were changing around her. The flat, utilitarian sprawl of the highway commercial corridor, giving way to wider streets, older trees, the occasional stone-pillared gate at the entrance to a subdivision. The rain was softening slightly. Or maybe she had simply gotten used to it. She passed a shopping center she recognized from a delivery she'd made years ago, when she'd had a second job doing rideshare. And the familiarity of it grounded her somehow, reminded her that the city was navigable, even in the dark. She found the street on the GPS she'd memorized and turned onto it. The pavement here was smoother. The curbs higher and cleaner. There were no streetlights in the traditional sense. Instead, low stone lanterns lined the edges of the road at intervals, casting small, warm pools of light that felt more decorative than practical. The trees were old and enormous, and their branches arched over the road so that driving through them felt like entering a different kind of space, quieter, more formal, the kind of space that had been designed to communicate that something significant was at the end of it. She slowed instinctively. Her cheap sedan, with its cracked dashboard and its bad sounds and its orange check engine light, felt suddenly absurd against this backdrop, and she felt a flash of something she recognized as class anxiety, the particular discomfort of being conspicuously out of place. The address resolved itself into a gate. It was not the kind of gate that suggested security so much as the kind that suggested scale, tall, iron, set into a stone archway with small cameras at each pillar, illuminated from below by lights that cast the metalwork in sharp relief against the wet night sky. She pulled up to the call box and rolled down her window. A voice came through promptly. A man's voice, professional, even. She told him her name and said she was there to return something that had been left at the gas station where she worked. There was a pause. She heard voices, indistinct, a brief exchange. Then the voice asked for the name of the item's owner. She said she wasn't sure of his full name, but that he had left a wallet, and there was a license inside. She read out what was on the license. There was a longer pause this time. The gate opened. She pulled through slowly, following a gravel drive that curved between the trees and opened onto a forecourt the size of a small parking lot. The house beyond it was illuminated against the dark sky, and Monica looked at it through her windshield, with the kind of concentrated stillness that comes over a person when they encounter something so far outside their daily reality that the brain needs an extra moment to process it as real. It was not a house in any sense she had been applying to the word. It was a structure of pale stone and dark glass that spread wide across the hillside, its wings extending in both directions from a central entrance framed by columns. There were lights in every window, warm and golden, and somewhere near the east wing she could see what looked like a greenhouse. A fountain stood at the center of the forecourt, its water running even in the rain. She thought, involuntarily, of the cardboard in her left shoe. A man in a dark jacket came to meet her before she'd fully gotten out of her car. He was polite and formal, and he asked her to wait while he confirmed things inside. She stood beside her car in the rain, her jacket pulled closed, and looked at the house and thought about the distance between the world she had driven from and the world she was standing in, and what it meant that both of them existed on the same planet, in the same city, under the same rain. She did not have to wait long. The front door opened, and the man from the gas station walked out. He recognized her immediately. She could see it in the way his face changed. The slight lift of his chin, the recognition crossing his features like weather. He came down the steps toward her without an umbrella, indifferent to the rain in the way that people are when they are entirely focused on what is in front of them. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her, and she reached into her jacket and took out the wallet and held it out to him. He took it and looked at it for a long moment without opening it. Then he looked at her. He said her name. She realized he must have gotten it from the gate attendant, and he said, with a quiet plainness that she would remember for a long time, that he had been trying to figure out how this was going to end. He opened the wallet. He looked at the cash. He looked at the cards. He looked at everything, methodically, the way a person looks at something when they are not merely checking that it's there but accounting for its full presence. Then he closed it and looked at her again. He asked if she had driven 40 miles tonight to return this. She said yes. He asked if she had noticed how much was inside. She said she had. He said he wanted to ask her something, and he paused, and she had the impression that he was choosing his words with genuine care, not performing thoughtfulness but actually practicing it. He asked, knowing what was in there, why had she come? She thought about it for a moment. Even though she already knew the answer, because the question deserved the honesty of a real pause. She said that the money wasn't hers, that it had never been hers, regardless of whether anyone knew she had it, that doing the right thing wasn't something she needed an audience for. He was quiet. The rain was lighter now, almost a mist. Somewhere inside the house, she could hear faint music. He looked at her for a long time, not in the measuring way of someone calculating an angle, but in the way of someone who is genuinely moved and is trying to understand why. Then he asked her to come inside. The inside of the house was warm and low lit, and Monica followed the man through a foyer that was larger than her apartment's entire floor plan. She noticed things the way she always noticed things, carefully, without making it obvious. A painting on the wall that was clearly significant but not showy. Bookshelves with the particular density of books that are actually read. Floors that were stone but had the worn quality of age rather than the polished look of newness. It was not a house that was trying to impress anyone. It was a house that had simply been lived in for a long time, by someone with means and taste, and no particular need to announce either. He led her to a sitting room near the back of the main hall, and she sat in a chair across from him, still in her jacket, her hands clasped in her lap. He told her his name was Richard Harrison. He said it plainly, as though he were not sure if it would mean anything to her. She thought about the name and where she had heard it, and placed it slowly. She had seen it on the spine of a business magazine in the waiting room of a mechanic's shop 2 years ago. A profile. She had not read it closely. He watched her recognition arrive and gave it space, and then he said with a wryness that surprised her that he had not expected to be recognized by anyone at a gas station that evening. She said she hadn't recognized him when he came in. She had just thought he seemed like someone who had seen things. He smiled at that, a genuine smile, the kind that reached the eyes and stayed. He talked for a while. He talked the way people talk when they have been carrying something for a long time and have unexpectedly found someone worth saying it to. He told her that he had grown up in a town 2 hours outside Houston, in a house with a roof that leaked, and a father who worked 3 jobs and still came up short most months. He told her he had worked at a gas station himself at 17, not so different from the one she worked at, he said, just a little older and a little more rundown. He told her about sleeping in his car for 4 months in his mid-20s when a business venture failed and took everything he had with it, and about the woman at a diner who had let him eat for free twice a week for 2 months because she said he looked like someone worth betting on. He said he had thought about her many times over the years. He had never been able to find her. He said her name was Carol, and she had had a laugh that sounded like she was surprised by it every time. He talked about the years of building, of failure and rebuilding, of the specific and unglamorous work of making something from nothing, not the edited, highlight reel version he gave to journalists, but the real version, the version with the fear and the doubt, and the months when the numbers did not work and he had to decide, every single morning, whether to keep going. He talked about what success had given him and what it had, over time, quietly taken away. The easy trust of strangers, the simple pleasure of moving through the world unrecognized, the baseline assumption that people were mostly decent. He said that money had a way of distorting the picture that the higher you went, the more people showed you a version of themselves designed specifically for your consumption, and after long enough you started to wonder if you'd ever seen anything real. He said Monica was the first person in longer than he could remember who had done something purely because it was right, not for recognition, not for reward, not even because she expected anything in return. She had driven 40 miles in the rain in a car that sounded like it was in pain because she had found something that didn't belong to her and wanted to give it back. He said that might not sound like much to her. He said it sounded like everything to him. Monica listened to all of this and did not interrupt. She had the quality, rare in people who had been underestimated for a long time, of being fully present in a conversation without performing her presence. She asked one question, toward the end. Whether he thought people were generally decent, or whether he thought decency was the exception. He thought about it genuinely. He said he thought most people wanted to be decent, but that circumstances had a way of narrowing the options they felt they had, and that sometimes what looked like a failure of character was actually a failure of context. He said she had proven something tonight about what a person does when they have real options, when they actually have the choice to take or give back, and that it told him more about a person than any interview, any reference, any credentials could. Before she left, he said he wanted to help her. He said it carefully, watching her face for the particular pride that sometimes makes people resist help even when they need it, the pride that comes from having managed alone for so long that accepting assistance feels like a kind of defeat. She felt it. She recognized it in herself, and for a moment, she almost said no, almost deflected with a small courtesy, almost retreated to the safe position of not wanting to owe anything to anyone. But she stopped herself. She thought about the cardboard in her shoe. She thought about the car in the driveway, making sounds she didn't know the name for. She thought about the electric bill and the cousin who was patient but not infinitely so. She said, carefully, that she was open to a conversation. He smiled at that. He said that was all he needed. In the days that followed, things happened with a speed and completeness that felt almost administrative, as though Richard Harrison, having made a decision, moved on the decision the way large objects move, with momentum and without particular drama. A message came to Monica through a number she didn't recognize, identifying the sender as Richard's assistant, a woman named Patricia, who had a calm, efficient manner that Monica would come to appreciate enormously. Patricia arranged for Monica's car to be assessed by a mechanic and then simply replaced, not repaired, replaced with a late-model used sedan that was clean and quiet and did not have a check engine light. The details of the transaction were handled without Monica being required to negotiate or explain or perform gratitude. It was done the way things are done when someone has decided to do them. The outstanding debt, the collections notice on the electric bill, the remaining balance on one of the car repairs, the informal loan from her cousin was cleared in a way that was private and thorough. No one made a ceremony of it. Patricia sent her an email with a summary of what had been handled, and a note from Richard that said simply, "Consider it a correction." Monica sat at her kitchen table and read the email 3 times, and then looked around her apartment for a while, without doing anything in particular. She was not sure what the appropriate response to this was, but she thought it might just be stillness. The larger thing came a week later. Patricia called and asked if Monica would be willing to come in for a conversation at the Harrison Group's offices in downtown Houston. Monica said yes. She drove downtown in her new car and took the elevator to the 14th floor and sat in a conference room with large windows overlooking the city and waited. Richard came in himself, not a subordinate, not a representative, but Richard and he sat across from her and said he had spent the past week thinking about her situation and about his company and about what he was about to propose. He told her that the Harrison Group had a customer experience division that had been underperforming for 2 years. Not because the work was hard or the resources weren't there, but because the division had been managed by people who thought about customers as a category rather than as human beings, people who ran the metrics but didn't understand the texture of what it actually felt like to be served well and to serve well. He said he had been looking for someone who understood service the way a vocation is understood. Not as a transaction, but as a relationship. Not as an obligation, but as a form of care. He said he wanted her to consider a management role in that division. He said the title was Customer Relations Director. That it came with full benefits, a car allowance, and a salary that was, he acknowledged, more than she had been earning. Considerably more. Monica looked at him across the table and felt a sensation she had no ready name for it. It was not pure joy. It was not disbelief. It was something quieter and more foundational than either of those, like something that had been leaning for a very long time, finally finding a wall to rest against. She asked him to say the salary figure again. He said it. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the table, and in that silence she did the math she had trained herself to do automatically. The rent on a better apartment, the full health insurance, the car payment that wouldn't be a crisis. She thought about calling her cousin. She thought about her mother, who had passed 4 years ago and who had always said that patience was not passive, that it was an act of faith, sustained in the face of evidence that nothing was going to change. She thought her mother would have had something to say about this moment. She thought she probably would have said, "I told you." Then she said she had one condition. He asked what it was. She said she wanted to be evaluated on the work, not on the story that, in a year, if the division wasn't better. She expected to be told, and that she wasn't interested in being anyone's charity project. He looked at her with something that might have been admiration, and said that was exactly the kind of thing the person he was looking for would say. She started the following Monday. The learning curve was real, and Monica did not pretend otherwise. She had managed people informally. All her adult life had organized and smoothed and held things together in every job she'd ever had. But formal management was a different discipline, and she approached it with the same methodical seriousness she brought to everything. She asked questions she was not embarrassed to ask. She read. She listened more than she talked. She made mistakes and acknowledged them plainly, and when she did, she noticed that her team responded, not with reduced confidence, but with increased trust, as though honesty about error was itself a form of leadership they had not seen before and had not known to want. Within 6 months, the metrics in the division had shifted in every direction that mattered: response times, customer retention, internal team satisfaction scores. Patricia sent her a note at the 6-month mark that said simply, "He noticed." Monica printed it and pinned it to the corkboard above her desk, where it stayed. She moved out of the apartment with the thin walls and the bad radiator a few months after she started, and into a place that had real heat and windows that sealed properly. She paid her cousin back in full, with interest, and her cousin said the interest was unnecessary, and Monica said it was not. She bought herself a proper pair of shoes, not extravagant, just solid, the kind that would last. She bought 3 sets of clothes for work that fit the way clothes were supposed to fit. Small things. Things that should not have felt significant and did anyway. She kept the instant noodles in her cabinet not because she needed them anymore, but because she wanted to remember what it was like to need them. She also kept helping people. Not as a calculated act, not as a performance of virtue, but as simply the way she moved through the world. The receptionist at her building, who was going through a custody dispute, got a listening ear, and when Monica thought she could offer it, a practical suggestion. The young woman on her team, who was visibly overwhelmed at the start of a project, got an extra hour of Monica's time and a cup of coffee, and an honest conversation about scope and prioritization. The older gentleman at the garage where she got her oil changed, who was always at the front desk and who always looked tired, got a thank you card at the holidays with a note that said specifically what he had done well. These were not large gestures. They did not cost very much, but they were consistent. And after long enough, the people around Monica felt them the way you feel a steady, reliable warmth, something you might not name explicitly until it's gone. Almost exactly 1 year after the night she had driven 40 miles in the rain, the Harrison Group held its annual company gathering at a venue in downtown Houston. It was a large event, several hundred employees from across the country. And it had the particular energy of corporate occasions that are trying hard to also be human. Catered well, organized carefully, punctuated by speeches designed to remind people that their work mattered. Monica sat at a table near the front with her team, and she wore a dress she had bought specifically for the occasion. And she looked around at the people in the room and felt, for the first time in a very long time, a quiet and uncomplicated belonging. Richard spoke last. He was not the kind of speaker who filled space with volume. His mode was quieter than that, more direct. He talked about the year that had passed, and about what the company valued, not in the abstract principles way that often accompanied such speeches, but in the specific, detailed way of someone who had been paying attention. Near the end of his remarks, he said he wanted to say something about character. He said that in 30 years of building things, of hiring people and watching teams succeed and fail, he had come to believe one thing above most others, that the quality of an organization was not determined by its technology or its capital or its market position, but by the character of the people inside it. He said that character was not something that was forged in success. It was forged in the moments when doing the right thing was hard, when no one was looking, when the easier path was right there and available, and no one would have blamed you for taking it. He paused. He looked across the room. He said he had met, this past year, a person who had reminded him of something he had once known, but allowed the years to slowly obscure. That decency was not weakness. That integrity was not naivety. That the choice to act well in a moment of pressure was the most telling thing about a person, and that it was something that could not be manufactured or incentivized, but only recognized. He said he was grateful for the reminder. He reached to the table beside him and picked up a small object, a frame, simple and dark-edged, and he looked toward Monica's table and said her name. She stood, her heart moving at a pace that felt visible to her, though probably wasn't, and walked up to where he was standing. He handed her the frame. Inside, behind clean glass, on cream-colored stock, in a typeface that was serious without being stern, were the words she had said to him without having planned them. On a rainy night in a sitting room, she had entered not knowing what she was walking into. The words that said, in plain language, that the right thing does not depend on whether anyone is watching. She held the frame and looked at it, and felt the whole year, the whole 8 years, really, all of it pressed briefly against the inside of her chest like something that wants to be released. She didn't cry, though she came close. She looked up at Richard, and he looked back at her. And there was, in that exchange, the kind of acknowledgement between two people who have both been changed by something and both know it, and don't need to make it into more than what it was. She said thank you. He said he was the one who was grateful. The room applauded. And she walked back to her table, and someone on her team squeezed her arm, and she sat down and looked at the frame in her hands. After the event, she walked out of the venue alone. It was a clear night, the kind that comes after a long Houston summer, When the heat finally gives and the air turns briefly light and sweet, she stood on the sidewalk and held the frame and looked up at the sky, at the particular faint haze of a city sky with its buried stars. And she thought about the night she had driven 40 miles in the rain with a dying car and 11% on her phone battery and $8,000 in someone else's money pressed against her chest. She thought about standing at the counter and asking herself what kind of person she wanted to be. She thought about Gary telling her to put it in the safe. She thought about Marcus saying he wouldn't have done it. She thought about all the ways the story could have gone differently and the single, quiet moment in which it had not. She thought about Richard, who had grown up with a leaking roof and slept in his car and been fed twice a week by a woman named Carol, whose last name he didn't know. She thought about the kind of loneliness that accumulates at the top of things, the way success could become its own kind of isolation if you weren't careful, if you stopped being able to find the real thing in the faces of the people around you. She thought about what it meant to be the person who brought the real thing back to someone who had stopped expecting to find it. And she thought, too, about all the people like her, people working night shifts in bright-lit stations, people eating standing at counters, people keeping their collars ironed and their dignity intact against the steady pressure of not enough, who never got a story like this one. She did not feel guilty about her good fortune. She felt responsible to it. There was a difference, and she intended to honor it. She didn't have a word for what the last year had been. Not a windfall, because what had changed was not just material, not luck. Because luck implied randomness, and what had happened had followed, with a kind of quiet logic, from a single decision she had made standing behind a gas station counter in the middle of a rainy night. It had followed from a choice, from the specific and private choice to be, in one unremarkable moment when no one was watching, the person she had promised herself she would be. She tucked the frame under her arm and walked to her car. The night was soft and still. Somewhere nearby, someone was playing music that drifted out faintly through an open window and mixed with the smell of cooling asphalt and late summer and the particular sweetness of a city that was, for all its size and noise, full of individual lives quietly going on. Some moments that change a life don't arrive with any announcement. They don't come dressed in ceremony. They come the way this one had, in the form of a rainy night, a lost object, a 40-mile drive, and a decision that no one would have blamed her for skipping. The kind of decision that is made not in a moment of certainty but in a moment of choosing who you are when the choosing is hardest. The kind that costs you nothing you can measure and gives you back something you can't. Most people never know their own character until it is tested in the dark, in the quiet, with no witnesses and no guarantee. Monica Johnson had known hers for a long time. She had just been waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Honesty does not always change your bank account on the day you practice it. Integrity does not always show its returns in the same season, but the doors it opens quiet, real, lasting, are the ones that no amount of money could have unlocked from the other side. The right choice, made in the dark, has a way of finding light eventually, not because the universe is fair or the math always works out, but because character, practiced consistently, becomes a kind of gravity. It pulls things toward it. It makes the world reorganize slightly in its direction. Monica Johnson drove home on a clear night, with the frame in the passenger seat, and the sky open above her, and her whole life, still being written, stretched out ahead.